February 1942, Darwin, Northern Territory. The smoke still rose from the harbour 3 days after the bombs fell. Black columns twisted into the pale morning sky like dark fingers reaching for heaven. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison stood at the edge of the burnt airfield and counted the wrecks. 8 Hudson bombers sat in twisted piles of metal, their wings pointed at odd angles. Oil stains spread across the concrete like dark blood. The smell of burned rubber and aviation fuel hung heavy in the hot air. It made his throat tight when he breathed. Jimmy was 24 years old. 6 months ago, he had been dusting crops over wheat fields in Queensland. Now, he wore the uniform of the Royal Australian Air Force. His hand still remembered the feel of his crop duster's controls. Flying low, staying under 50 feet. Skimming over golden wheat like a bird hunting mice. That was the only flying he really knew. The RAAF had given him 6 months of training. They taught him to fly their bombers, but they never taught him to fight like this. The Japanese had come on February 19th. 242 aircraft had filled the sky over Darwin. The thunder of their engines shook the ground. The whistle of falling bombs made people cover their ears and pray. When it ended, 235 people were dead. Ships burned in the harbour. Buildings lay in ruins. The whole city looked like a giant had stepped on it and walked away. Jimmy walked past a burned Hudson. Its tail number was still visible through the soot. He had flown one just like it last week. The metal frame looked like the skeleton of some huge animal. The propellers were bent backwards. He touched the twisted metal. It was still warm. "Morrison!" A voice called from across the field. Squadron Leader Patterson marched toward him. His face was red from the sun and from anger. "Get to the briefing room, now." The briefing room was a hot metal building that baked like an oven in the Australian sun. 12 other pilots sat on wooden benches. Their faces were young. Most looked barely old enough to shave. Jimmy took a seat near the back, sweat already soaked through his shirt. Patterson stood at the front, next to a map of the Pacific. Red markers showed Japanese positions. They covered the map like a disease spreading across skin. Timor, Ambon, New Guinea, the Philippines. So much red. "Gentlemen," Patterson began. His voice was tired. "Command wants another bombing run on Kupang. High altitude, 20,000 feet. Standard approach from the northeast." A pilot near the front raised his hand. "Sir, didn't we try that last week? We lost 5 planes." "4 planes," Patterson corrected, but his eyes looked away when he said it. Jimmy knew the real numbers. In the last 2 months, the RAAF had lost 47% of all aircraft sent against Japanese positions. Almost half. The Japanese Zero fighters climbed faster than Allied bombers. They turned tighter. They shot straighter. Every mission was like flying into a meat grinder. "The Americans say high altitude is the only way," Patterson continued. "The British agree. We go in at 20,000 feet. We drop our bombs. We come home." "If we make it home," someone muttered. Jimmy stood up. His chair scraped against the concrete floor. Every head turned to look at him. "Sir, I have an idea." Patterson's eyebrows went up. "An idea, Lieutenant Morrison. You've been in the RAAF for 6 months. Please, share your wisdom with us." The other pilots laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind people make when they're scared. Jimmy walked to the map. His finger traced a line from Darwin to Kupang. 820 kilometers over open ocean. "What if we don't fly high? What if we fly low, real low, 50 feet above the water?" The room went silent. Then someone laughed again, but this time it wasn't nervous. It was the laugh you give to a crazy person. 50 feet? Patterson shook his head. "Morrison, have you lost your mind? At that altitude, one mistake and you're in the ocean. One wrong move and your wing clips a wave." "I used to crop dust at 15 meters, Jimmy said. He used the height in meters because that's what the RAAF called it. 50 feet, 15 meters, same thing. I flew over wheat fields for 3 years. Never crashed once. You stay low enough, their radar can't see you. You come in with the sun behind you at dawn. They're blind. By the time they spot you, you're already dropping bombs. An American observer stood up from the corner. Major Bradley from the United States Army Air Force. He had the look of a man who had seen too many young pilots die. Son, this isn't crop dusting. This is war. The Japanese have coastal observers. They have patrol boats. They have anti-aircraft guns that will tear you apart. They're looking up, Jimmy said. Everyone looks up for bombers. Nobody looks at the water. A British wing commander cleared his throat. The doctrine is clear, Lieutenant. High-altitude bombing, precision targeting. That's how modern air warfare works. How's that working for us? Jimmy asked. The words came out harder than he meant. We lost 4 planes last week, 5 the week before. How many more do we lose before we try something different? Patterson slammed his hand on the table. The map jumped. That's enough, Morrison. We follow orders. We fly high. We come home. Or we don't come home. But we don't fly suicide missions 50 feet off the deck because some farm boy thinks he knows better than every military expert in the Allied forces. Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it. He could see it in his mind. The Hudson bomber screaming across the water, so low the propeller wash kicked up spray. The Japanese base appearing suddenly over the horizon. Bombs away, pull up, gone before they could react, like dusting crops, like hunting rabbits from a plane, fast, low, unexpected. If we can't fly over them, Jimmy said quietly, we fly under them. You're dismissed, Patterson said. All of you. We fly the mission tomorrow at 0600, high altitude, by the book. The pilots filed out. Some of them looked at Jimmy with curiosity, others with pity. The American major stopped next to him on the way out. I admire your spirit, son, Bradley said. But spirit doesn't stop bullets. Flying at 50 feet over open ocean for 800 kilometers? That's not bravery. That's suicide. Jimmy watched them leave. Through the open door, he could see the burnt airfield, the twisted metal, the empty spaces where planes used to sit. Tomorrow more planes would fly high. Tomorrow more wouldn't come back. And everyone would keep doing the same thing because that's what the experts said to do. He thought about his crop duster back home. How it felt to fly so low the wheels almost touched the wheat. How the grasshoppers would jump up as he passed. How free it felt. How alive. Maybe the experts were wrong. Maybe you didn't always have to fly high to win. Maybe sometimes you had to fly so low that nobody expected it. So low that it seemed crazy. So low that it just might work. March 1942, a secret airfield 60 kilometers south of Darwin. The base didn't appear on any maps. Just a strip of cleared red dirt hidden between eucalyptus trees. The heat made the air shimmer above the runway. Kangaroos watched from the tree line as Jimmy Morrison walked toward the first Hudson bomber. Wing Commander Edward Pearson stood beside the aircraft. He was 52 years old. His grey hair was cut short. Deep lines creased his face from years of flying in the Royal Air Force. He had bombed Germany 23 times during the First War. He knew what worked and what didn't. Show me, Pearson said. That was all. Just 2 words. The previous week had been the worst of Jimmy's life. Patterson had reported him for insubordination. The American commanders called his idea reckless. A British colonel wrote a memo calling it colonial desperation from untrained farm boys. Jimmy thought his military career was over before it started. Then Pearson had appeared. He pulled Jimmy aside after another failed high-altitude mission. 5 more planes lost. 18 more men dead or missing. Pearson's eyes were red from crying for boys he had trained. I saw you crop dust once, Pearson had said, near Brisbane in '39. You flew under telephone wires. I thought you were insane, but you never touched them. Not once. Show me how you'd hit Kupang. Now Jimmy climbed into the Hudson's cockpit. His hands moved over the controls like a pianist touching familiar keys. The 3 other crew members settled into their positions. Navigator, bombardier, rear gunner, all of them rookies. The bombardier was 20 years old. He still had pimples on his chin. Jimmy started the engines. The twin propellers coughed to life. Blue smoke puffed from the exhausts. The whole plane shook and rattled. He pushed the throttle forward. The Hudson rolled down the dirt strip. Faster. Faster. The tail lifted. Then they were airborne. He took the plane out over the ocean. The water stretched forever, blue and empty. The coast of Australia disappeared behind them. Jimmy pushed the control stick forward. The nose dropped. The altimeter unwound like a clock running backwards. 500 feet, 300, 100. "Sir, we're too low," the navigator shouted over the engine noise. Jimmy kept pushing forward. 50 feet now, 15 meters. The ocean rushed past below them. He could see individual waves, white foam on the crests. The spray kicked up by the propellers left a white trail behind them like a scar on the water. At this height, every bump of air felt like hitting a pothole. The plane jumped and shook. Salt spray hit the windscreen. The props screamed. One wrong move, and the wing would clip a wave. They would cartwheel across the water and sink in seconds. But Jimmy's hands were steady. 3 years of crop dusting had taught him to read the air, to feel the plane as part of his body. He knew exactly where the water was without looking. His eyes stayed locked ahead on the horizon. He flew like this for 20 minutes, then pulled up hard. The G-force pressed everyone into their seats. He climbed to 500 feet and turned back toward land. Pearson was waiting when they touched down. Jimmy cut the engines. Silence filled the cockpit, except for the tick of cooling metal. "How much fuel did you use?" Pearson asked. Jimmy checked the gauges. "About 280 liters for 30 minutes. Pearson did the math in his head. Kupang is 820 kilometers away. Round trip is 1,640 kilometers. At that altitude, you'd need approximately 2,847 liters of fuel. Our tanks hold 2,400, Jimmy said. So we add extra tanks. Remove the armor plating. Strip everything that isn't needed. Pearson looked at the Hudson like a sculptor seeing a statue inside a block of stone. We make her light. We make her fast. We make her invisible. Over the next 2 weeks, mechanics worked on 12 Hudson bombers. They ripped out the heavy armor that protected the crew. They removed extra guns. They welded on auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay. Each plane could now carry 2,900 liters of fuel. Barely enough for the mission with a small safety margin. Pearson recruited 11 more pilots. All of them were young. The oldest was 24, the youngest was 19. Together, they had less than 100 hours of combat flying. Most had trained on crop dusters or civilian planes before the war. They were farm boys and mechanics' sons. Not one had attended a proper military academy. The experts say this won't work, Pearson told them at the first briefing. The Americans refuse to participate. They say we're wasting resources. The British think we're desperate colonials playing at war. Maybe they're right. But I've watched good men die doing it their way. So now we try something different. The training began at dawn each day. Jimmy led the formations. They practiced flying at exactly 15 meters above the water. Not 14, not 16, exactly 15. At that height, they were below most radar coverage. At that height, they were invisible until the last moment. The first week, 2 planes nearly crashed. One pilot pulled up too hard and stalled 50 feet above the ocean. He barely recovered. Another clipped a wave with his wingtip. The impact nearly flipped the plane, but both pilots survived. Both learned. They flew the same route 47 times over 18 days. Darwin to a marker buoy 820 kilometers north and back. They timed every second. They measured fuel consumption down to the liter. They practiced approaching with the sun behind them so enemy observers would be blinded. The mechanics learned to service the planes in complete darkness. The navigators memorized the route by stars. The bombardiers practiced dropping dummy bombs while flying at 245 kilometers per hour, just 15 meters up. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes at that altitude. On March 27th, Pearson called them together. Tomorrow we go. For real. Kupang Harbor, Japanese naval base. Intelligence says there are 8 vessels in port. Fuel depot on the north shore. Ammunition dump to the east. He spread a map on the table. Aerial photographs showed the harbor. The Japanese ships looked like toys from high altitude. But Jimmy knew they were real, full of real sailors, protected by real guns. We take off at 0430, fly north in formation, maintain radio silence, hit the harbor at 0615 when the sun is behind us. Drop everything we have. Turn and run flat out. Don't stop for anything. Don't try to be heroes. Drop your bombs and get home. Pearson looked at each pilot. His eyes held something between pride and fear. The experts say you're too young, too inexperienced. They say this mission is suicide. Maybe it is, but I've seen what happens when we fight their way. Tomorrow, we fight our way. That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot and listened to the other pilots breathing in the darkness. Some snored, some whispered prayers, some just stared at the ceiling. At 4 a.m, the mechanics started the engines. 12 Hudsons roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness. Their propellers cut the air like scythes. Jimmy climbed into his cockpit. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. He thought about wheat fields back home, about flying low over golden crops, about the simple joy of being alive in the sky. The tower gave clearance. One by one, the Hudsons rolled down the runway and lifted into the darkness. They formed up over the ocean, 12 planes flying wing to wing, heading north toward the enemy, toward history, toward 820 kilometers of open water at 15 meters altitude. The rookies were going to war. The sun rose behind them like a ball of fire climbing out of the ocean. Orange light spread across the water. Jimmy kept his eyes forward. The altimeter read 15 meters. Exactly 15. His hands gripped the control stick so hard his knuckles turned white. Sweat ran down his face even though the cockpit was cold from the rushing wind. They had been flying for 2 hours and 40 minutes. 820 kilometers of empty ocean. 12 Hudson bombers in tight formation. Wingtips almost touching. So close, Jimmy could see the face of the pilot next to him. A kid named Danny who had fixed tractors in Tasmania before the war. His lips moved in silent prayer. The ocean rushed past below them at 245 kilometers per hour. Salt spray coated the windscreen. Jimmy's bombardier kept wiping it away with a rag. The roar of the engines bounced off the water and filled the cockpit. It sounded like constant thunder, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with sea air. It made Jimmy's stomach tight. "Land ahead," the navigator shouted. 2 kilometers. Jimmy saw it. A dark line on the horizon. Timor. Enemy territory. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Every muscle in his body was tense. This was it. No turning back now. The coast appeared fast. Too fast. Palm trees and white beaches rushed toward them. Then they were over land. The Hudson stayed low, 15 meters above the ground now instead of water. They screamed over fishing villages, over rice fields. People looked up in shock as the planes roared past. 30 seconds to target, the navigator called. Jimmy could see Kupang harbor ahead. The morning sun was directly behind them now. Perfect. Anyone looking their way would be staring into blinding light. The Japanese guards at the harbor couldn't see them coming. Not until it was too late. The harbor appeared over a small hill. 8 Japanese vessels sat at anchor. Destroyers, supply ships, a small cruiser. They looked peaceful in the morning light. Sailors moved on the decks. Some were cooking breakfast. Some were washing clothes. None of them looked up. 400 meters. The Japanese sentries finally spotted them. Jimmy saw men pointing, mouths open in shock. One sentry reached for an alarm bell. Too late. Way too late. Bombs away! 12 Hudsons opened their bomb bays at once. The bombs fell in a perfect pattern. They tumbled through the air for less than 2 seconds before hitting their targets. The first explosion lifted a destroyer's bow out of the water. The second blew apart a fuel tanker. Then the whole harbour erupted in fire and smoke. Jimmy pulled up hard. The G-force crushed him into his seat. His vision went grey at the edges. The Hudson climbed straight up like a rocket. Behind him, the other planes followed. They scattered in all directions like seeds blown by wind. More explosions shook the air. A fuel depot on the north shore went up in a massive fireball. Orange flames shot 200 meters into the sky. Black smoke rolled up like a tornado. Then the ammunition dump exploded. The sound was so loud, Jimmy felt it in his bones, even through the engine noise. Anti-aircraft fire began too late. Traces streaked through the sky where the Hudsons had been seconds before. Japanese gunners were aiming high, looking for bombers at 6,000 meters, but the Australians were already gone, racing back toward the ocean at full throttle. Jimmy dropped back down to 15 meters over the water. The other Hudsons formed up around him. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. Everyone made it. Every single plane. His chest felt tight with relief. They flew home in silence. The fuel gauges dropped steadily. By the time they saw the Australian coast, the needles were almost on empty. Jimmy's plane had less than 50 litres left when the wheels touched down at the secret airfield. The ground crew rushed toward them. Mechanics, officers, even Wing Commander Pearson ran across the tarmac. The pilots climbed out of their planes on shaky legs. Some sat on the ground. Some threw up from the stress. Danny the tractor mechanic just stood there crying with relief. Pearson grabbed Jimmy's shoulders. "Did you hit them?" "All 8 ships," Jimmy said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like someone else talking. "The fuel depot, the ammunition dump, everything." Over the next 3 days, reconnaissance planes took photographs of Kupang Harbour. The pictures showed devastation. 4 Japanese destroyers sunk or sinking. 2 supply ships burned to the waterline. 1 cruiser listing badly to port. The fuel depot was still burning. The ammunition dump was just a crater in the ground. Intelligence officers did the calculations. Previous high-altitude bombing raids hit only 11% of their targets. Jimmy's wave-hopping attack hit 73%. More than 7 out of every 10 bombs found their mark. The experts had said it was impossible. The rookies had proved them wrong. Word spread fast through Allied command. The Americans sent observers to watch the technique. The British requested detailed reports. Within 2 weeks, Pearson was training new pilots. Within a month, 89 Australian aircraft were practicing wave-hopping attacks. The secret airfield wasn't secret anymore. Jimmy wrote his after-action report on a battered typewriter. His hand still shook from the mission. He tried to explain how it worked. Why it worked. At the end, he wrote 9 words that would be quoted in history books decades later. They were looking at the sky. We came from the sea. The Japanese responded quickly. They installed new, low-level radar at every coastal base. They increased patrol boats. They positioned observers to watch the water. But by then it was too late. The wave-hopping technique had spread through the Allied forces like wildfire. In April, the Americans launched the famous Doolittle Raid on Tokyo. They flew B-25 bombers off an aircraft carrier. The attack used modified versions of the wave-hopping approach, ultra-low altitude, surprise approach, strike fast and run. The tactics looked familiar because they were based on what 12 Australian rookies had done first. By June 1942, the RAAF had flown 34 successful wave-hopping missions. They hit Japanese positions across the Pacific, supply dumps, airfields, naval bases, troop concentrations. The success rate remained high. Losses remained low. The technique that experts called suicide became standard operating procedure. American tactical planners studied every mission report. They used the wave-hopping data to develop new approaches for the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Low-level attacks became part of the strategy that would eventually win the war. But none of this mattered to Jimmy as he sat in the briefing room 3 days after the Kupang raid. What mattered was the empty chairs. In the last 2 months of high-altitude bombing, those chairs had belonged to dead pilots. Good men who followed the experts' advice and died for it. Now those chairs were filled with living pilots. Rookies who had done the impossible and survived. Squadron Leader Patterson walked in. He looked older than he had a month ago. Tired, his uniform was wrinkled. He stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat. "The brass wants more missions," he said. "More wave-hopping attacks. They want to expand the program, train more pilots, hit more targets." He paused, looked directly at Jimmy. "They also want to court-martial you for insubordination." The room went silent. "But they can't," Patterson continued, "because you were right and they were wrong. Because you saved lives by breaking rules. Because sometimes the book is wrong and the farm boy is right." He almost smiled. "So instead, they're promoting you to squadron leader. You'll train the next group of pilots. Teach them what you know." Jimmy didn't know what to say. He just nodded. That night, he walked out to the airfield. The 12 Hudsons sat in a row. Battle-scarred, but whole. Everyone had come home. He touched the nose of his plane. The metal was cool under his hand. Tomorrow, they would fly again. More missions, more targets, more chances to die. But tonight, they were alive. 12 planes, 12 crews, 48 men who had flown 15 meters above the ocean at dawn and lived to tell about it. 48 men who proved that sometimes the craziest idea is the right one. The rookies had struck first, and the war would never be the same. The war continued for 3 more years after that first mission to Kupang. Jimmy Morrison flew 67 more wave-hopping attacks. Each time he pushed his Hudson down to 15 meters above the water. Each time he felt the same fear in his belly. Each time he came home alive. By September 1942, every Allied Air Force in the Pacific Theater was teaching pilots the ultra-low-level approach. American flight schools added it to their training programs. British squadrons practiced it over the English Channel. Even the Soviets requested information about the technique for use against German positions. The wave-hopping method saved approximately 840 aircraft from anti-aircraft fire over the next 2 years. That number came from careful Allied records. 840 planes that would have been shot down using high-altitude bombing. Each plane carried 4 to 6 crew members. The math was simple. The technique saved somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 lives. The tactic evolved as the war progressed. Engineers designed special low-level bomb sites. Pilots learned to skip bombs across the water like flat stones. The bombs would bounce once, twice, then slam into the side of enemy ships below the waterline. It was devastating. Japanese destroyers couldn't defend against attacks they couldn't see coming. By 1943, wave hopping was no longer experimental. It was standard doctrine. Flight manuals included detailed instructions. New pilots learned it before their first combat mission. The crazy idea that experts had mocked became the way everyone fought. But Jimmy never sought glory for it. He never gave interviews, never wrote a book, never claimed to be the father of low-level bombing. When reporters tried to talk to him, he just shrugged and said he flew the plane. Other men made the real decisions. Other men deserved the credit. In June 1943, the Distinguished Flying Cross arrived in the mail. A small medal in a wooden box. The citation said it was for gallantry and devotion to duty. Jimmy put it in a drawer and never wore it. The medal felt wrong somehow, like taking credit for doing what needed to be done. The American Doolittle Raid on Tokyo happened 1 month after Kupang. 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier. They flew low over Japan and dropped their bombs. The attack made headlines around the world. President Roosevelt called it a triumph. The pilots became heroes. Movies were made about their bravery. Nobody mentioned 12 Australian rookies who had done it first. The history books focused on Doolittle. The newspapers printed his photograph. The world remembered Tokyo and forgot Kupang. Jimmy didn't mind. Let them have their glory. He had something better. He had his crew alive. He had those empty chairs filled with living pilots. Wing Commander Pearson died in 1944. His plane was shot down over the Philippines. He was flying a wave-hopping attack when it happened. The irony wasn't lost on Jimmy. The technique that saved so many lives couldn't save the man who championed it. War didn't care about irony. When the war ended in August 1945, Jimmy was 27 years old. He looked 40. His hair had gone grey at the temples. Lines creased his face like cracks in old leather. His hands shook sometimes from all those hours gripping the control stick at 15 meters. The RAAF offered him a permanent position. They wanted him to train peacetime pilots, teach the next generation. But Jimmy was done with flying. Done with war. Done with watching young men die, no matter how good the tactics were. He went home to Queensland, back to his farm, back to the wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. He bought a new crop duster to replace the one he had sold in 1941. It felt right in his hands, familiar, safe. For 38 years, Jimmy dusted crops. He flew low over wheat and corn and barley, 15 meters up, just like the old days, just like the war. But nobody was shooting at him now. The only danger was telephone wires and the occasional bird. Kids in town knew him as the quiet farmer who flew the crop duster. Sometimes they asked about the war. Jimmy would say he flew bombers. That was all. Just flew bombers. The kids would lose interest and run off to play. Only once did someone recognize what he had done. A military historian visited in 1978. She was writing a book about innovation in the Pacific War. She had found Jimmy's name in old RAAF records. She asked him about Kupang, about wave hopping, about being first. "We weren't first," Jimmy told her. "Crop dusters had been flying low for decades. We just applied it to war." "But you were the first to use it in combat," she insisted. "Against Japan, before anyone else." Jimmy shrugged. "Someone would have figured it out eventually. Maybe it would have been Americans, maybe British, maybe someone else. We just happened to do it first because we didn't know any better." The historian wrote down his words. Her book came out 2 years later. It had one paragraph about Kupang. One paragraph in 300 pages. The rest was about Doolittle and Midway and all the famous battles everyone knew. Jimmy died in 1983 at age 65. A heart attack took him while he was fixing his crop duster's engine. He was found in his barn with a wrench in his hand and oil on his shirt. A quiet death for a quiet man. His funeral was small. Maybe 40 people came. Neighbours, a few old war buddies. No military honours. No speeches about bravery. Just a simple service in a country church. They buried him next to his wife under a eucalyptus tree. The wave-hopping technique outlived him by decades. Modern militaries still study it. The principles remain sound. Fly low, stay invisible, strike fast. The exact same tactics Jimmy used in 1942. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet forces developed tactics based on ultra-low-level flight. Bombers practiced flying 50 feet above the ground to avoid radar. Cruise missiles used the same approach. Come in low, stay hidden. Hit the target before anyone knows you're there. In recent conflicts, the pattern repeated. Syrian rebels used drones flying at extremely low altitudes to evade government radar. The drones would pop up at the last second, drop explosives, and disappear. It was wave hopping with robots instead of pilots. Military theorists have a name for what Jimmy did. They call it asymmetric warfare, using unconventional tactics to defeat superior forces. Fighting smart instead of fighting fair. The experts write papers about it. Generals teach it at war colleges. But Jimmy would have laughed at the fancy words. He wasn't a theorist. He was just a farm boy who knew how to fly low. The military experts said it was impossible. So he did it anyway because he didn't know enough to be scared. That's the real lesson of Kupang. Innovation doesn't come from experts who know all the rules. It comes from rookies who don't know what's impossible. The crop duster didn't know you couldn't bomb a harbour at 15 meters. So he tried it, and it worked. Every breakthrough in history follows the same pattern. Someone who doesn't know better tries something crazy. The experts say it will fail. Sometimes it does fail. But sometimes it works. And when it works, it changes everything. The 12 rookies who flew to Kupang that March morning had less than 100 combat hours between them. They were children playing at war. But they succeeded because they hadn't learned all the ways to fail. They flew like they were dusting wheat fields. They didn't know it was supposed to be impossible. Jimmy Morrison never became famous. History barely remembers his name. But every pilot who flies low-level combat missions is following in his footsteps. Every drone operator using terrain-following tactics is applying his principles. The wave-hopping technique that saved thousands of lives started with one quiet farm boy who refused to accept what the experts said. Sometimes inexperience is the greatest advantage. Sometimes not knowing the rules is the key to breaking them. Sometimes the rookie sees solutions that the veteran is too educated to imagine. Jimmy knew this without putting it into words. He knew it in his hands as they gripped the control stick. He knew it in his gut as the Hudson screamed across the water. He knew it in his heart when all 12 planes came home alive. The experts were wrong. The farm boys were right. And the war was never the same.